Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. When it comes to the automotive industry, motorsport has always played a crucial role. Not only can it serve as a testbed for new and potentially revolutionary technology, it's also a great avenue for marketing. Many car manufacturers have built their entire identities around their on-track exploits. And it makes perfect sense. What better way to show your superiority over other car makers than to beat them to a pulp in direct competition? In fact, Ferrari, arguably the most revered name in the business, famously started out as a racing team and only began making road cars to fund their racing, an approach which you'd have to say has worked out pretty well for them. But as we all know, for every success story like this, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of failures. Motorsport is a tough business, and finding success in it is no easy feat. At the same time, there are also plenty of companies who instead choose to market their brand in a different, less performance-oriented direction. However, what you might not know is that many of these manufacturers have, at one time or another, also dabbled in high-level motorsport. And so today, I want to take you all on a tour of these unusual brands in racing. Now, if you dig deep enough, you'll find that pretty much every car from every brand, no matter how unsuitable, has been raced at one point or another. But in this video, I want to focus mainly on times when marques like these have competed in famous, high-profile events. Alright, let's dive in. Japanese car maker Daihatsu is known almost exclusively for their compact models, most of which falling under the Kei-Jidosha or light vehicle category. Beyond that, the only other things they currently produce are rebadged models from their parent company Toyota. However, they do still make one model with some sports pedigree, the Copen 2-seater convertible. It even received a juiced-up GR Sport version in 2019. But if we rewind back to the 1960s, motorsport was really starting to take off in Japan. The Japanese automotive industry had grown to the point where they felt like they could start building their own high-performance sports cars, similar to those most commonly seen in Europe. And along with the likes of Nissan and Toyota, Daihatsu were one of the manufacturers who were there from day one. At the time, they produced a car called the Compagno, and in 1966 they decided to use it as a basis for a new race car. That car would be known as the P3 and was soon entered into the Japanese Grand Prix at the brand new Fuji Speedway. The P3 was fitted with a small 1.3-litre inline-4 engine making about 100 horsepower, which put it into the lowest GP1 class. Of the two cars entered, one would retire, but the other would go on to finish 7th overall and 1st in class, marking Daihatsu's first major victory. The car would only race on two more occasions the following year, the Suzuka 1000 km where it failed to finish, and the Suzuka 12 Hours where it came home 4th and again won its class. For 1967, Daihatsu brought out an evolution of the P3 called the P5. Whereas the previous car was front-engined, like the Compagno road car it was based on, the 1.3-litre engine was mid-mounted in the P5, giving it a much better weight distribution. At the same time, the whole car only weighed a touch over 500 kilos, and the upgraded unit was now making around 140 horsepower. This gave it the potential to be a real giant killer, but sadly it wouldn't get the opportunity in its first outing at the Japanese GP, as the two P5s entered failed to qualify for the race. For 1968, Daihatsu made an all-out assault on the Japanese GP, entering 4 P5s in total. In the end, 3 of them would finish, with the lead number 15 car coming home in 10th overall and 1st in class. An even more impressive result was to come at the Suzuka 1000 km later that year, as a P5 was not only able to win in class, but it achieved an incredible 3rd overall against far more powerful opposition from the likes of Nissan, Toyota, and Porsche. However, in spite of its strong showing, the writing was already on the wall for the P5. The previous year, Toyota became a major shareholder in Daihatsu, and the brand would start to concentrate solely on compact models. As such, its sports car program was seen as somewhat irrelevant, and following one final race at Suzuka in 1969, where the car would actually achieve its best finish yet of 2nd overall, the P5 was retired from racing. In current day, Daihatsu still owns one of the 4 P5s ever built, and it was restored to its full glory in 2019. Beyond the P-Series sports cars, Daihatsu's presence in high-profile motorsport has been very limited since then. Various iterations of their Charade hatchback were entered by privateers at the Nürburgring 24 Hours throughout the 80s and 90s. Their best result here was in 1994 when a charade finished 22nd overall and 2nd in class. The charade was also used for rallying, and achieved a number of class victories in international events in the 80s and 90s. During this period, it was sometimes able to mix it with the more powerful all-wheel drive cars through strong reliability and low weight, somewhat reminiscent of the P5. But did you know that Daihatsu had planned to enter a charade into Group B? The Charade 926R was shown off in 1985 as a mid-engined rear-wheel drive version of the car, co-developed by Daihatsu. As the car still had a sub-1 litre engine, performance wouldn't have been mind-blowing, but it still would have been extremely competitive in its subclass. Ultimately, with the demise of Group B after 1986, the car was mothballed, and Daihatsu continued racing the standard charade under Group A regs, going on to achieve more decent results. Their most notable event has to be the 1993 Safari Rally, where charades were not only able to lock out the top 3 in class, but also 5th, 6th, and 7th places overall. After this, their efforts in international rallying kind of trail off to nothing. So, Daihatsu may not have had the most longevity in motorsports, but through their brief entries, they showed themselves as a brand that was often capable of punching well above their weight. Proton is a Malaysian company that makes a wide range of everyday passenger cars, many of which being rebadged models from other brands. Currently, they don't have much of a presence outside of Asia, but it wasn't always like this. Founded in the 1980s, the company started off by producing rebodied Mitsubishis as part of a joint venture, and this would eventually lead to their first foray into motorsports. The Petronas Eon Racing Team, or PERT for short, was formed in the late 80s as Proton's motorsport division with support from Mitsubishi Ralliards. As such, they mainly focused on rallying, and achieved a decent amount of success within Asia with cars like the Proton Saga and Iswara, models that were based on Mitsubishis of course. By the mid-90s, Mitsubishi had firmly established itself as a key player in the World Rally Championship with their Lancer Evolution models. So, to give Proton a bit more exposure, it was decided that PERT would start competing at select WRC rounds with a Mitsubishi Evo, but rebranded as a Proton Wira 4-wheel drive. The driver was Malaysian Karamjit Singh, who achieved modest results throughout the mid-90s. However, at a particularly attritional 1997 Rally Indonesia, he was able to finish 6th overall, thus scoring his and Proton's first ever championship point on the global stage. At this time, Proton had ambitions of entering the WRC in their own right, and even commissioned ProDrive to build them a car based on their Putra Coupe model in 1997. Unsurprisingly, the car was based on a Mitsubishi powertrain, but had styling very reminiscent of the Subaru Impreza WRC, a car that was also developed by ProDrive. Sadly, Proton decided not to proceed with the project for undisclosed reasons. Instead, they continued to rebrand Mitsubishi models such as the Evo 6, which became the Proton PERT in the early 2000s. And with Karamjit Singh again at the wheel, they were actually able to win the production WRC title in 2002, taking victory in both Cyprus and Kenya. After this, the Petronas Eon Racing Team was retired and instead replaced with R3. Standing for Race, Rally, Research, R3 was created to consolidate all of Proton's motorsport activities under one brand. Back in 1996, Proton became the majority owners of British sports car makers Lotus, and each of their road cars thereafter were co-developed by the Hethel-based company. Outside of their homelands, the UK was Proton's largest market. So to gain even more exposure, they decided to enter the country's biggest domestic series, the British Touring Car Championship. A pair of Proton Wajas, branded as Impians in the UK, were entered under the guise of Team Petronas Cintium Proton in the 2002 series, driven by David Leslie and Phil Bennett. 1999 runner-up Leslie was able to achieve 4 podium finishes across the year with a best result of 2nd at Croft, ending the year a respectable 7th in the championship. However, Bennett wasn't able to perform as strongly, languishing in a lowly 17th in the standings with a best race result of 6th at Brands Hatch. The 2002 car was kind of rushed together. Powered by a Renault-derived 2-litre engine modified by Mountune Racing, it was built from a finished production Impian as opposed to a bare body shell, as they couldn't be imported from Malaysia quick enough. This meant that its ultimate potential was always compromised, so under those conditions, its debut year was actually pretty solid. But sadly, this was as good as it would get. The car was developed further for 2003, but Leslie slumped to 11th in the standings with a best finish of 6th place, and Bennett once again ended up down in 17th. Proton tried again in 2004 with an all-new driver lineup of South African Sean Watson-Smith and Malaysian Farid Khairaman, but the former could only muster 14th with a highest race finish of 7th, and the latter way down in 23rd after failing to finish in the top 10 all year. As the competitiveness of the series steadily grew following its post-Super Touring slump, the Impians simply couldn't cut it, with Proton ending up dead last in the manufacturer standings for all 3 seasons they competed in. After the Impian was retired from the BTCC, it did make appearances in the Asian Touring Car Championship over the next couple of years, where it achieved stronger results in a much less competitive field. Whilst it isn't a Proton model, it is worth noting that Proton R3 were involved with running the Lotus Exige 300RR. This car won the Merdeka Millennium Endurance Race at Sepang in both 2005 and 2006, and even made a few international appearances. It was entered into the Sepang Super GT round in 2005, but failed to start the race due to engine troubles, as well as the FIA GT 500km of Zhuhai, where it finished 14th overall and 2nd in class. Also, one of its drivers was Tengku Janlei, the head of Proton R3. After the dissolution of PERTS, Proton took a hiatus from international rallying, but they would eventually return. In 2009, they debuted the Proton Satria Neo Super 2000, which they entered into the Intercontinental Rally Challenge. The car shows strong potential, finishing 2nd in the Rally of Scotland with ex-WRC driver Alistair McRae at the wheel. Proton only made sporadic appearances in the IRC over the next few years, often struggling with reliability and not achieving any more noteworthy results. However, they did find success in the Asia Pacific Rally Championship, taking a 1-2 in the 2011 season with McRae and Chris Atkinson, albeit as the only works team in the series. In 2012, Proton would reappear in the World Rally Championship in the Super 2000 class. Per Gunnar Andersson would take victories in both Sweden and Finland, eventually finishing 2nd in the championship to Craig Breen. In spite of this strong showing, Proton made the decision to focus only on regional motorsports in the years after, thus ending the Satria Neo's time on the international stage. On the circuit racing front, Proton made a surprise return to the BTCC in 2011 with Welch Motorsports. Unlike their previous efforts, this was a true independent entry, with no involvement from Proton themselves. The Gen 2, which appeared from round 6 onwards, was built to the then new NGTC regulations, meaning that mechanically it had little relevance to the road car. Daniel Welch would drive it to a best finish of 10th that year, before it was rebuilt as the Proton Persona for the 2012 season. This year the car would perform decently, scoring a best finish of 4th at Alton Park, and Welch would end up 15th in the standings, despite missing a handful of races owing to budgetary issues. 2013 would see him take a step down to 18th in the championship, before the team expanded to 2 cars and decided to start building their own engines in 2014. This would prove to be a disastrous decision, as the engines would end up underpowered, resulting in new driver Ollie Jackson finishing 28th in the final results with 0 points, and Welch being classified 32nd and dead last. Welch continued to race the Persona for 2 more forgettable seasons, before retiring the car after Proton had left the UK market following a sharp decline in sales. In 2017, Proton shut down its R3 division altogether. This coincided with their decision to sell a majority stake in Lotus to Chinese company Geely, who also took a minority share in Proton itself, bringing a swift end to their performance endeavours. It has to be said that of all the brands featured in this video, Proton is the one with easily the biggest legacy in motorsport, so much so that I even considered not including it here. However, for most people outside of Malaysia, their efforts in racing have been somewhat forgotten, and today the brand stands in a very different position. Whilst they were never one of the major players, Proton's biggest strength was in how they aligned themselves with other brands that had far more expertise, namely Mitsubishi and Lotus. Through these partnerships, they were able to achieve modest success and establish the Proton name on the global stage. Daewoo was a large, multifaceted South Korean conglomerate, but for most of us in the West, they're best known for their former automotive division, Daewoo Motors. They made pretty run-of-the-mill everyday cars such as the Matiz, their best-selling model overseas. To be blunt, Daewoo's relevance in racing was extremely limited, other than one of their production models sometimes being marketed as the Daewoo Racer. In fact, they're arguably best remembered for a time when they didn't compete. In the 90s, Daewoo was looking to increase their profile as their road car division was gaining steam. So in late 1994, they announced their intention to compete in Formula 1. The initial plan was to first enter by rebranding an existing engine, and then later develop their own. Central to this project was former Porsche and BMW executive Ulrich Beers, who is often credited for helping Daewoo develop into such a rising force after being appointed in 1993. Ultimately, like many aspiring F1 entrants of this era, Daewoo's plans would come to nothing, although rumours of their entry still persisted until the end of the decade. However, when it comes to Daewoo's that did compete in major motorsport events, there are still a few cases to mention. The Daewoo Cielo was campaigned sporadically in the WRC throughout the 90s. At the 1995 Safari Rally, local specialist Azhar Anwar managed to win the FIA 2-litre class driving a Cielo, albeit as one of only 2 entries in the category. In 1997, he was able to achieve second at the same event against notably more competition, finishing behind only a Proton Satria, coincidentally enough. But around this time, Daewoo actually had a factory-backed program in another off-road racing series. The Andros Trophy was an ice racing championship held almost exclusively in France. The Daewoo Nexia first appeared in the series in 1995. The car was built and run by the Belgian RAS Sport team, who are also known for competing in the WRC. Despite the relative obscurity of the series outside of its homeland, the Andros Trophy attracted names from all across the world of motorsport. Case in point, Team Daewoo's lineup included ex-F1 driver and Le Mans 24 Hours runner-up, Jean-Marc Gounon. In the 1996 to 1997 season, he finished 8th in the standings, which included winning the final round of the season. The Nexia would continue to be campaigned for the next few years with modest results, but sadly any more information about the car is very difficult to come by. By 1999, Daewoo was in financial trouble, which was almost certainly a factor in them leaving the Andros Trophy. But more importantly, they were forced to declare bankruptcy, and the brand was then taken over by General Motors. After that, their cars only competed occasionally in national events within South Korea, before the brand was discontinued in 2011, with all of their existing models being rebadged as Chevrolets. So yes, far from the longest story on our list, but certainly an interesting one. From potential F1 entry, to international rally winners, a decently successful factory-backed program in quite an unexpected championship, and then bankruptcy all within the space of half a decade. I don't think any other brand can really top that. Since scaling back their passenger vehicle efforts in the early 90s, the Isuzu name has been mainly linked with commercial vehicles, like trucks and buses, as well as pickups. At the moment, that's basically all they make, but their backstory is quite different. In the 1960s, they produced a car called the Bullet, and it soon became a pretty popular base model for racing. The Bullet was notable at this time because it was raced in countries across 4 different continents: Europe, North America, Australia, and of course its native Japan, achieving decent results pretty much everywhere. The car showed good speed, but was often outclassed by the Nissan Skylines and Toyota 2000 GTs. However, it did achieve an overall victory at the Fuji 12 Hours Grand Touring event in 1968, a feat that it would repeat the following year. But at the same time, Isuzu had ambitions of competing for even greater honours. So in 1969, they brought out their first ever purpose-built race car, the Bullet R6. Taking the form of a sleek prototype, the R6 was drastically different from anything Isuzu had made before. However, it did still share the same 1.6-litre engine found in the Bullet production car, but now upgraded to make about 150 horsepower. A notable detail was that the R6 was so low that a hole had to be cut into the roof of one of the cars to allow one of the drivers, Tachio Yonamura, to actually fit in it when wearing a helmet. However, in their quest for sports car supremacy, Isuzu didn't just design one new race car, they made 2. The R7, named after the Group 7 class it was designed for, was an even bigger departure for the brand. It sported a comparatively huge 5-litre Chevrolet V8 tuned by Moon Eyes, meaning that it was clearly aiming for outright victories. Both the R6 and R7 debuted at the 1969 Japanese Grand Prix, but neither performed as hoped. The 2 R6s both suffered mechanical trouble, with one retiring and the other coming home as the last car still running in 19th place. Meanwhile, the pair of R7s were totally outclassed by Nissan's R382, Toyota's revamped 7, and various privately entered Porsches. Although they both reached the finish, technical problems limited them to just 15th and 16th places. The R7 would be raced on one further occasion that year, a one-off Can-Am crossover event at Fuji Speedway, where it would come home in 6th place, 12 laps behind the winning Toyota. For 1970, Isuzu was gearing up for another assault on the Japanese GP with the R7, as well as an updated open-top version of the R6. But the unexpected withdrawal of first Nissan for economic reasons, and then Toyota in response to their main rival's absence, resulted in the whole event being cancelled. 1971 saw both the R6 Spider and R7 return to action in the Fuji Grand Champion Series, the effective replacement for the Japanese GP, which had since become an event for Formula cars. In this new competition, they performed decently over the next couple of years, achieving a handful of top 5 finishes, but still being bested by foreign machines from the likes of McLaren, Chevron, and Lola. For 1973, they brought out the Spider 2000, which again achieved middling results before seeming to disappear at the end of the season. It would take a while for Isuzu to reappear in major competition, with their next notable outing not coming until the mid-80s. The Japanese Touring Car Championship was founded in 1985, and the following year, the Isuzu Gemini debuted in it. Competing in Division 3 for cars with 1600cc or lower engines, it managed to achieve some decent results, including a handful of top 3 finishes in class across 1987. Isuzu took a year out in 1989 and returned in 1990 with a new model based on the 5-door JT190 Irmscher Gemini. In spite of the car having a new engine, it was noticeably less competitive, as their key rivals in the Honda Civic and Toyota Corolla had improved considerably. The redesigned JT191 Gemini was entered starting in 1991 by Team Koyama Garage, but failed to make any sort of impact. It made one final appearance at Sugo in 1993 where it failed to qualify, before fading from the series entirely. The Gemini was also run in the N1 Endurance Series and All Japan Rally Championship around this time, and although information is scarce, various sources state that it was actually a class champion in the latter. However, in an alternate timeline, Isuzu's racing legacy could have looked very different. In 1991, Team Lotus was looking for a new engine partner in Formula 1 after a dismal season with Lamborghini. In the interim, they used Judd V8 power, but at one point they did test an Isuzu V12. The V12 project had originally just started as an engineering exercise for a few employees within Isuzu, but soon the idea of actually running it in an F1 car gained traction. At this time, Isuzu and Lotus were linked by General Motors, who had a minority stake in the former and were the outright owners of the latter. Through this connection, the idea of running Isuzu's V12 in Lotus's F1 car became a reality in a mid-season test at Silverstone, with a view to Isuzu possibly supplying engines to Team Lotus full-time from 1992. But whilst Lotus praised the performance of the engine that had been shoehorned into a chassis that wasn't designed for it, they ultimately decided against the idea, preferring to partner with a more established F1 engine supplier. Isuzu didn't pursue any other teams to run their engine, although they did build a bizarre pickup truck concept which they stuffed the V12 into, the Como F1 Supertruck. In the years after, Isuzu's corporate strategy changed so that more emphasis was placed on their commercial and utility vehicles, meaning that competing in motorsport was kind of irrelevant. Isuzu's time on the racing scene was mostly forgettable, but they did have some bright spots. Personally, the Bellet R6 is a car that always sticks in my mind for its jaw-dropping profile. It's incredible to think that it was the brand's first ever purpose-built racer. KGM, previously known as SsangYong, is a Korean brand that has almost nothing to do with performance cars. Currently, they produce a fleet of SUVs and pickups, and looking back historically, this has always been their niche. When it comes to motorsports, there have been a handful of SsangYong one-make championships, and the brand has competed sporadically in the Dakar Rally, but those aren't what I want to talk about today. In the late 80s, SsangYong Motors was established by the SsangYong Group, and one of its first actions was to purchase the low-volume British sports car company Panther Westwinds. In 1990, under supervision from SsangYong, they began making a mid-engined all-wheel drive sports car called the Panther Solo. Despite high hopes, the car ended up being a commercial flop, and only around 25 examples were ever made. However, this didn't stop SsangYong from trying to resurrect the Solo in 1995. Ultimately, this new version of the car would never be made, and the brand has been defunct since then, but hopefully this adds some context for what happened next. Around this time, ex-F1 driver and Le Mans 24 Hours winner Bertrand Gachot was approached by SsangYong to spearhead an assault on the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The brand had just started selling their own cars in Europe and felt like their association with just commercial and utility vehicles was limiting their brand appeal, as well as their other ventures like Panther. At the time, they had a technological partnership with Mercedes, resulting in some of their vehicles using Mercedes engines, and some even being rebadged Mercedes models. So the only stipulation for the Le Mans project was that the car had to use a Mercedes engine. To this end, Gasho soon settled on running a Welter Racing LMP2 machine retrofitted with a 2-litre Mercedes engine with a turbocharger strapped on for good measure. The end result would be christened the SsangYong Solo Le Mans, in reference to the Panther Solo, which at this time SsangYong was still trying to resurrect. The racing history of this car is disappointingly short. Gasho failed to pre-qualify for Le Mans in 1996, ending up 31st on the timesheets after having mechanical problems. The car did reappear for a 4-hour event on the Bugatti circuit later that year, and from all accounts it performed well by qualifying second, but retired in the main event with an unspecified issue. After this, SsangYong decided not to renew its deal with Gasho, and its Le Mans adventure came to a close. In the years after, through financial struggles and various different owners, SsangYong, now KGM, has settled into its role as makers of perfectly average 4x4s, to the point where their previous Le Mans ambitions now just feel like a strange fever dream. When it comes to cars, the Russian Lada brand certainly makes them. Its history has been dominated by basic vehicles for the masses, in fact, providing such as the whole reason how it came to be. Given that they were some of the only cars that people living in the former Soviet Union could even access, they were naturally very prevalent within regional circuit and rally events. But their exploits on the global stage have been far more limited. Adding to the list of obscure and mostly unraced Group B rally cars, here is the Lada Samara EVA. This car was supposedly developed as an after-hours project in an Estonian truck factory, featuring a mid-mounted 4-cylinder engine pushing out around 300 horsepower. Very little was carried over from the production Samara, known as the VAZ 2108 in its home country. In spite of its unusual origins, the car was given the green light to compete in international events with Soviet government backing. Unfortunately, this all occurred in 1986, with Group B being abolished just a few months later, so the car never raced in any major events. However, earlier in the decade, Lada had been competing at the grueling Dakar Rally with their 4x4 Niva model, courtesy of a French importer but with factory backing. Its high durability led to some impressive results, 3rd overall in 1981, as well as 2nd in 1982 and 1983. When Group B was outlawed, attention soon turned to the prospective Group S category, but this was quickly aborted. However, at this point work had already begun on a Samara Group S prototype, and not wanting this to be wasted, the model was soon adapted to compete at the Dakar Rally. At the time, Lada had a kind of partnership with Porsche, and with them winning the Dakar Rally in 1986 using the all-wheel drive 959, the decision was made to simply take the drivetrain from the Porsche and put it in the Lada. This was then complemented by a 3.6-litre Porsche Flat 6 engine and previous Porsche factory driver Jackie X at the wheel. This Lada Porsche hybrid would finish 7th in the 1990 edition of the event courtesy of X, claiming a single-stage win on the way, before being improved on by Hubert Auriol the following year, who managed 2-stage wins on his way to 5th place. Of course, for as interesting as this tale is, we all know that this Samara T3 had basically nothing to do with the car it was based on. However, following the demise of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, Russia became a lot more connected with the outside world. This turn of events explains how Russian privateer rally drivers started competing in international events more often, usually with cars from their homeland. In 1993, the WRC introduced the FIA 2-litre Cup, better known as F2, and a few of the competitors in that inaugural year drove Lada Samaras. At the Acropolis Rally in Greece, Sergei Alyosov piloted his Samara to 2nd in class, and then later at the New Zealand Rally, Alexander Artemenko managed to win. By this point, the Samara was already very outdated, so unsurprisingly there were no further results to speak of. But this still represented Lada's first ever victory in a World Championship event. But when it came to getting their seconds, that would take some time. As far as their factory-backed efforts were concerned, there wasn't much to talk about following their Dakar assault in the 80s and early 90s. But in 2007, a new racing team was formed under the name of Russian Bears Motorsports. They started competing as a privateer entry in the World Touring Car Championship with BMWs, but had ambitions of running their own machine. So in 2008, they built an all-new car based on the Lada 110, and it was raced across the season by Jaap van Lagen, Kirill Ladygin, and team owner Viktor Shapovalov. As expected from a startup entry, results were modest, with a best finish of 14th across the year. However, seeing potential in the project, Lada decided to throw official backing behind it, and the cars returned in 2009 under the Lada Sport banner. A new car was also in development based on the Priora model, and this would debut halfway through the season. At the same time, Shapovalov decided to take a step back from driving duties, and he was replaced in the team by former BTCC champion James Thompson. He would go on to score the team's first ever points with a pair of 6th place finishes at round 9 in Imola. In spite of the improvement across the year, Lada decided not to return to the series in 2010. But they didn't stay away for long. Lada reappeared in the WTCC in 2012, with James Thompson entering 2 rounds in a new car based on the Lada Granta, prior to the brand returning full-time in 2013. The Granta World Touring car was actually adapted from the Granta One-Make Cup car that had been introduced the previous year, which meant that it was somewhat limited compared to its competitors. Thompson managed 14th in the standings in 2013 with a best result of 5th, but new teammate Mikhail Kozlovsky would fail to score a single point. However, they would still achieve 2nd in the manufacturer standings, on account of there only being one other works team on the grid. But this status as a full works team made Lada somewhat appealing, and goes some way to explain how they were able to lure over 2012 champion Rob Huff. 2014 was the first year of the TC1 regulations, and the Granta was updated accordingly, but it also marked the debut of the Citroën C-Elise. Their works team went on to absolutely dominate the season, winning 3/4 of the races that year, but Huff performed valiantly, taking 2nd in Race 2 at Argentina, before claiming Lada's first WTCC win in Beijing. He followed this up by also taking the top step at the season finale in Macau, ending the year 10th in the standings. 2015 would see Lada unveil a new model, the Vesta World Touring Car. With it, Huff was again able to secure 10th in the championship, but this time there were no wins, just a couple of podiums, as Citroën was even more dominant than the year before. It's worth noting that he was joined by a revolving cast of 5 different teammates across the year. Into 2016, the Lada team would return with a refreshed driver lineup that featured veteran Gabriele Tarquini, as well as Nicky Katzberg and Hugo Valence. However, it was reported during the season that this would be Lada's final year in the series. As it turned out, it would also be their most competitive, finishing on the podium several times and taking 3 wins courtesy of Tarquini and Katzberg. Easily their finest moment was in front of the team's home crowd in Moscow, where they locked out the top 2 in both races. At the end of the year, Katzberg was classified 7th, Tarquini 9th, and Valente 12th. Following their exit from the series, they did produce a Vesta to the TCR rule set in partnership with Orica, but this was mainly used in smaller national championships. In 2018, the car did appear in the German VLN series with Lubna Motorsports, but failed to make an impact. And Lada Sport did make a one-off entry in the WTCR at Sochi Autodrome in 2021, which appears to be their most recent major motorsport appearance. Given certain global events within the past few years, it seems unlikely that we'll see this Russian state-owned company competing on the world stage in the near future. But at least they have a pretty interesting, if often forgotten legacy for us to look back on. Hino is a brand which is so far removed from performance cars and racing that I'm sure there are many of you who've never even heard of it. If you're in the know, then you'll be aware that they're a Japanese marque who produce heavy vehicles, like trucks and buses. But if we once again take a trip back to the 1960s, we can find that they used to make passenger cars. They began by producing a Hino-branded Renault 4CV under license, and then in 1961 they brought out their first original car, the Hino Contessa. This car was still heavily based on Renault technology though, including its 900cc engine mounted in the rear. Not soon after, it was decided to take the Contessa racing. The first Japanese Grand Prix took place at Suzuka in 1963, and no fewer than 7 Contessas lined up on the grid. Of these, 3 would reach the checkered flag, with the lead car of Yoshisugu Tachihara finishing 2nd in class. Contessas would continue to race in events across Japan for the next few years with modest results, but Hino were planning to go bigger. Taking inspiration from Alpine in France, in 1965, they developed a prototype sports car. This car was fitted with a tuned version of the 1.3-litre engine that was first used in the Contessa 1300 that same year. With this, it was able to hit over 200 km an hour in testing. The following year, a new model was developed from this prototype intended for circuit racing. This car, dubbed the Hino GTP, first appeared in action in an event at Fuji Speedway in August 1966, with one of the two cars entered managing to finish the roughly 1 hour long event. Hino had plans to race the car internationally as well, and so they created a handful of left-hand drive models. In fact, work was well underway on an updated version for 1967 before the entire project was shelved for reasons we'll get to in just a moment. If we go back to the Contessa, we can see that the car was also raced in the US starting in 1964. The story goes that Peter Brock, not the Aussie racing driver, but instead the US designer who worked at GM and Shelby, was approached by actor Bob Dunham to prepare a Hino Contessa for him to race in SCCA events. Brock obliged and soon began running a second car for himself with decent success. At this point, Hino then approached him directly to build them a race car which they could take to Le Mans. After all, this was the same Peter Brock who had just recently designed the Shelby Cobra Daytona. So, under his new Brock Racing Enterprises banner, he set to work on the car that would eventually be known as the Samurai. Again fitted with the 1.3-litre unit from the Contessa 1300, the car only made about 110 horsepower, but it weighed just 530 kilos. It also had a very streamlined body and even a movable rear wing, very much novel technology in those days. The car attracted much attention, even featuring on the front cover of Road and Track magazine. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Hino were not in the best position financially, and Toyota were poised to buy a significant share in the company. However, if it came out that Hino were going to race a radical new prototype race car, this could potentially send their stock price through the roof, thus costing Toyota a fortune. So they attempted to bribe Brock into not building the car, but to no avail. And when the Samurai then debuted at the Japanese GP in 1967, it had a suspiciously hard time getting through scrutineering. After some heated discussion, it eventually did, but when the car finally hit the track, it was discovered that the high levels of downforce it produced were causing it to scrape along the ground. The car wouldn't be able to race in this state, but without Toyota knowing this, Brock made a deal with them to not race the Samurai, and in return, Toyota would contract him to build them a race car to take to Le Mans. Soon after, Toyota's merger with Hino became official, and Hino then focused primarily on their heavy vehicles as well as production of Toyota models. And with this, Hino's racing endeavours were over. This series of events cut short the factory programs of both the GTP and Samurai, two Hino race cars that were designed completely independently from one another. However, the Samurai was at least granted a second life in the US, where it was raced by Ron Bianchi for several years in SCCA with decent success. Since then, Hino's only notable motorsport involvement has been at the Dakar Rally, where they've entered trucks since 1991 and have managed to win their class a few times. In 2023, Australian supercars outfit Team 18 decided to do a one-off livery referencing the Samurai, as Hino Trucks is one of their title sponsors. The Hino story really is unique, but it's also one that gets too easily forgotten. If they had ended up at Le Mans like they envisioned, who knows what could have happened. Good news, it's time to talk about Dacia. The Romanian brand is primarily known for building small, cheap cars under the umbrella of the Renault Group. But as we've seen many times by now, just because you don't make anything fast or sporty doesn't mean you can't go racing. Much like Lada, Dacias have historically been popular in regional events across the Eastern Bloc. But when it came to their first major motorsport outing, that wouldn't come until 2009. Prior to the actual road car itself being unveiled, Dacia showed off the V6-powered Duster Andros Trophy version with the announcement that it was going to be piloted by racing legend Alain Prost. Now that's how you make a debut. In the Andros Trophy itself, Prost would finish as the series runner-up that season in the Sol Duster, a feat that he would match the following year. Now, we've all seen the Volvo 850 Estate and Peugeot 826 Super Touring cars, right? Well, check this out. The Dacia Logi Glass. This car replaced the Duster from the 2011/2012 season, with Prost still at the wheel, and a second car now entered for his son, Nicholas. And get this, with this car based on the Logi MPV, which was now mid-engine by the way, Alain Prost was able to win the Andros Trophy, his third title in the series. The Logi would return the next year with another ex-F1 winner leading the charge, Olivier Panis. He would manage a respectable third overall before Dacia called time on the project at the end of the season. The car would reappear in the series with the independent Sport Garage team, managing to take a few more event wins until it was retired for good in 2016. Amazingly, the Andros Trophy Duster is not the most extreme version of the car we've ever seen. In 2011, Dacia announced that they were taking the car to the Pikes Peak hill climb. But this wasn't just any old Duster, it was the Duster No Limit, complete with big wing and a Nissan GTR sourced V6 making 850 horsepower. Driven by Jean-Philippe Daewoo, the car would finish 3rd overall in the event, with a time of 10 minutes and 17 seconds. The Duster would return the following year to challenge for the overall win, but Daewoo would crash late in his run after losing the brakes. Starting in 2013, a car based on the Dacia Duster, albeit badged as a Renault, would also compete at the Dakar Rally. In 2015, it was upgraded with a Nissan V8 engine, but didn't achieve any noteworthy results before being retired after 2016. Also starting in 2013, Dacia would appear in a somewhat unexpected place, the Scandinavian Touring Car Championship. At this point, the STCC was a silhouette series where each of the cars were built around a common chassis. They also all used a spec Nissan V6, coincidentally enough. In 2013, the Swedish Dacia dealer team entered the series with a machine that was styled like the Dacia road cars, but wasn't based on any specific model. The car would be driven by Matthias Andersson over the next 4 seasons, finishing 8th in the championship in 2013, 6th in 2014, 5th in 2015, and 6th again in 2016. During this time, he achieved a number of podiums and 1 single victory, coming in the car's final ever race at Knutstorp in 2016. As a result of dwindling grid numbers, the series switched to the TCR rule set from 2017, and the Dacia STCC would be retired indefinitely. But from high downforce track weapons, let's look at something a bit more grounded. In 2021, a curious name appeared on the entry list for the Nürburgring 24 Hours, a first-generation Dacia Logan. No, this wasn't some GTR-swapped monster that was Dacia in name only, although it did have a 2-litre Renault Sport unit making about 200 horsepower. But aside from that, it really was just a normal race-prepped Dacia Logan. Thanks to being by far the slowest car in the race, the Logan and the team who ran it, Ollis Garage Racing, became an instant fan favourite, reaching a similar status to the legendary Opel Manta Foxtail. The squad, which included YouTuber Misha Sharadin, managed to finish the race in 98th overall, although most of the 24 hours was spent under red flags for heavy fog. The Dacia would return in 2022 and not only once again finish the race, but improved to 88th overall. In 2023, they made attempt number 3, but it was not so lucky for them. During the night, they were rear-ended at high speed by a Porsche 911 GT3, with the Logan suffering severe damage. Most assumed that that was game over for the car, and it was. But in 2024, Ollis Garage Racing announced that they had acquired a new Logan with a more powerful engine, and were ready to take on the N24 once more. 2024's edition of the event would not be its finest, as the weather intervened yet again to limit on-track action to just 7.5 hours, the shortest race in the event's history. Still, the Dacia did make it through in 102nd place. But in 2025, the team had another major setback as they were involved in a big accident at the N24 with an Aston Martin Vantage. Work is well underway to get the car repaired for the 2026 events, but these accidents really called into question the safety aspects of allowing cars of such drastically different speed to race together on a track as unforgiving as the Nordschleife. When it comes to a factory racing program, Dacia does currently have one with their Sandrider rally raid vehicle. It was developed jointly with ProDrive and Renault Alpine, and continues the trend of Dacias with Nissan engines, as it uses a version of the 3-litre V6 from the current Nissan Z. Dacia returned to the Dakar Rally in 2025 with a 3-car lineup that featured Sebastian Loeb, Nasser Al-Attiyah, and Cristina Gutierrez. Loeb and Gutierrez would both retire, the former after rolling and damaging his roll cage, and the latter with a technical issue, leaving Al-Attiyah to come home as the sole surviving Dacia in 4th place. And that just about brings us up to date. Of all the brands highlighted in this video, Dacia is the only one still with any amount of international motorsport presence. They may have joined the party quite late, but you'd have to say that Dacia's relatively short racing legacy is an interesting and varied one, and they're still adding to it to this very day. So there you go, that was the motorsport history of 8 automotive brands that we don't usually associate with performance or racing. I hope that through the course of this video, you've not only learned something new, but also have a greater appreciation for these companies and their efforts. I know that I certainly do. As always, thanks for watching, and have a good one.